Back in 1984, I was still just a kid and completely unaware of Apple's new fancy Macintosh. And to be perfectly honest, I was quite happy growing up with my Commodore 64. I can't recall ever wanting something else until much later. However, over the years, I have collected a few early Macs to play around with and explore. For some bloody reason, all four of my original Macs are more or less weird, and definitely in need of some restoration. For this year's Macintosh, I decided to bring them out and restore at least one of them. More or less randomly, I ended up restoring this Mac here, and that turned out to be a very lucky choice. When we opened up this Mac, we were greeted with massive corrosion inside. Apparently the battery had spilled its guts and was slowly eating away at this Mac. I made sure the battery was removed way back when I got it, but apparently it already was too late. This, however, is one very lucky Mac. The battery juice managed to find its way down the analog board between all the components, and only messed up a cheap and easily replaceable fuse holder and the legs of the power switch. For reasons not entirely clear to me, the juice then decided to eat away at the chassis, leaving the logic board virtually intact. My best guess is that it might have been stored at some weird angle that made a nasty liquid flow past all the vitals inside. So that being said, if you have one of these Macs in storage, you may want to pause this video and bring it out to remove the battery. This video is part 2 about this Mac. If you want to watch part 1 first, you will find the link right down below this video. In part 1 we did some archaeology and had a look at this Mac's origins. It turned out to be one of the original Macs with 128K on board. It's complete, unmodified and made in week 47 of the release year. Apparently the original owners of this Mac were no less than Harvard University. Getting computers in schools was a part of Steve Jobs' marketing strategy.
I think that computers can radically revolutionize the educational process around the world.
So I'm not surprised they dropped one of these off at Harvard. Anyways, we did a full disassembly and restored and cleaned the badly corroded chassis and a few other parts inside. I have since that video cleaned and restored the case with hydrogen peroxide and UV light. Today we are going to continue the restoration, and we are going to begin with the analog board. Okay, so our main concern here is this refa cap. These buggers tend to blow up and fill my studio with magic smoke. And the second issue is that there is quite a bit of dried up battery juice on the PCB. So we're going to neutralize it, and later we'll do a proper wash of this board. And the most common problem with these boards are actually cracked solder joints on these power connectors. So we're going to reflow them, whether they have cracked yet or not. Before we continue this restoration, I would like to thank the sponsor of this video, PCBWay. Aside from making excellent PCBs, they also do CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing and injection molding. Check out their shared projects page where you will find some really cool projects for your vintage PC. Get an instant quote now at PCBWay.com. Thank you PCBWay for supporting this channel. So let's remove the shield. And on these early boards, this shield is just stuck on with double-sided tape. And later boards have plastic clips. And if you're playing along here, don't ignore this label. The caps on this board may not be discharged yet, especially if the system is freshly tested. Okay, so what have we got here? Well, there's a dead bug. And the board seems to be made by Capetronic in Taiwan. And I think this is a date, 8445. So week 45 of 1984. That corresponds well with the serial number. And the battery juice has found its way to this side of the board too. So this ground plane here is all blotchy, and a couple of the traces down here have some black spots too. And same thing over here. So we're gonna have to clean those traces too. If I'm correctly informed, this bipolar cap here should also be replaced. Although it's not entirely clear to me why that is. But we'll go ahead and replace it. Okay, I guess we'll start by pulling this. Oh man, that fuse holder just fell apart. I just touched that thing and it just fell right off. So we're gonna have to replace this fuse holder. And I have to say I'm quite surprised that this machine actually booted. I guess we better remove that fuse holder before we neutralize the board. So I'm gonna add some fresh solder first to make this a little bit easier. Yeah, the solder comes off really easily on this board, so that's a good start. And now I think that crusty fuse holder should come right off. And it did. I guess we should remove the loose crap before we apply the acid. And actually it just comes right off, so perhaps we don't need acid on this board. Yeah, this battery juice has dried up, so it just comes right off. So we can clean this stuff off with just some IPA. Yeah, I think the cleaning is going to be much easier than I thought with this board. Let's see how easy this stuff here comes off. Yeah, it comes right off with just some IPA. So this is going to be an easy cleaning. Well, that was a nice surprise. I think we're going to remove the shield and put it back on after we have cleaned the board. Yeah, I'd say that's good enough for me. But the legs of the power switch definitely needs to be neutralized. So I'm going to apply some white vinegar. And I'm struggling a bit here because I managed to drop my camera the other day. And I broke the cable for my preview display. So I can't really see what I'm filming. But hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. And I won't know until I get the files on my PC. But luckily the camera didn't break. So I can continue to make videos. Well, it's not fizzling and it's not making any bubbles. So I guess that stuff has dried up and isn't causing any damage anymore. Well, I leave it on for a few minutes and then clean it up with some IPA. Okay, well it's been several minutes and it doesn't make any bubbles, so we can just clean that stuff off. Okay, I gave the battery compartment the same treatment and I did get some bubbles. So that battery juice was still active. I guess I'll just clean this stuff off with a wire brush pen. And we'll keep that original switch. Okay, that's good enough for me. And this switch gets to stay on the board. Okay, time for that reefer to come off. That damn thing has bent legs. So we're gonna have to straighten up those legs first. And that should make the desoldering much easier. And I don't think I need to add fresh solder on this board, because this solder comes off quite easily. And I spoke too soon, because this leg was a bit stubborn. Let's mix that old solder with some fresh leaded solder and try again. Yeah, that helped. And off you go, little reefer. Yeah, that's definitely cracked. But this is a lucky Mac, so it's not cracked enough. Well, if this stuff comes off this easily, perhaps we don't need to do a proper wash. So I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can clean this stuff off with just some IPA. And I like to avoid washing boards if I can, because then I need to leave them for a day to dry. That kind of halts the project. And yeah, this stuff definitely comes off with IPA. So this is just some rust from the chassis. Yeah, I'll do some more of this stuff off camera, because this isn't going to be interesting to watch. But as you can see, it comes off without giving me much trouble. Okay, so this reefer is X-rated, so I'm gonna replace it with a modern X2 cap. And as you can see, this modern cap is much smaller. And on many boards like this, you actually have two sets of holes. But not in this case. So make sure you order reefer caps with the correct footprint. And if you're a purist, you may want to close your eyes now, because these two through holes here are original, and I decided to add a second one here. So now this board can take the smaller cap. On most boards you couldn't really do this hack, but this board has some really thick traces, so there's plenty of room to make an extra through hole. And it obviously also needs to be a single layer board. Okay, let's get a new fuse holder on that board. And I wasn't expecting to find a broken fuse holder, so I had to borrow this one from another project. In fact, I don't think I have ever replaced a fuse holder in my entire life in any of my projects. So it's not a component that would typically fail. Okay, and the next step is to clean off these traces. Because if we don't get rid of that corrosion, it's gonna get worse. Okay, I'll probably do some more cleaning off camera. But now let's thin those traces. Because if we leave the bare copper exposed, it will eventually corrode. So I'm just going to use a tiny amount of solder on my largest tip. And tons of flux. And the only thing left now is to clean off that flux. I'll probably do a few more traces off camera. This is basically the process of how to make the board to stop corrode any further. For some reason, the solder joints on the brightness control are all corroded too. So I think it's wise to reflow these solder joints with some fresh flux. We might as well go ahead and reflow all the solder joints on the connectors, since they are known to crack. Okay, that should last for a few more decades. This board has 3 connectors in total. So let's treat them with some flux. and some fresh solder. And by the way, if you enjoy this type of content, let me know with a thumbs up. It helps me to grow the channel. And here's the third connector. So on most boards, this is actually the only thing you need to do. Well, aside from removing the reefer cap. And I'm cleaning up as I go because I don't want to have that huge mess of flux to take care of afterwards. The cleaning part is not the fun part. And this is a bit too much solder, but I'm gonna leave it like this. Okay, time to replace C1, the bipolar 3.9. So we're gonna have to straighten up those legs first. And the rest of the caps on this board are probably good for a few more years. But since we have the board out, we might as well replace all the electrolytics. The electrolyte inside these caps is corrosive and eventually it will leak out. And it could possibly damage other components. And I really don't want to check this board every few years to make sure that the caps aren't leaking. I'd much rather spend a few more minutes now. I guess I better cut that stuff here so we don't rip that coil off the board. And these buggers are a bit hard to find. So this is a bipolar 3.9 micro. So for C1 I'm gonna go with a modern replacement. This is a Panasonic film capacitor. So it obviously won't fit perfectly, but I think we can bodge it and make this work. So if we bend the legs, it should fit good enough. And the rest of the caps are just regular electrolytic caps. So C2 here is 4700 16 volts and very easy to find a replacement for. I think some of the footage I'm recording today is going to be slightly out of focus because the only preview I've got is the tiny display on the back of the camera, and by next week my new HDMI cable should have arrived, and I guess I'll avoid dropping my camera in the future. Okay, so I think this is C3, and sure enough that's our C3, and the board is a bit glossy around this cap. And I am of course keeping an eye out for electrolytes. And our C3 is a 220 micro. And the board is very clearly marked with polarity. So a very easy board to recap. Well, this is going pretty smoothly. So I'm gonna skip ahead here a bit. Unless something interesting happens. Okay, I skipped ahead here a bit. And I'm at C35 and C36, and there is some kind of liquid underneath. I couldn't tell if it's electrolyte or if it's battery juice, because it's quite close to the fuse that was damaged. But perhaps we will find out later when we check these caps. Unfortunately, I made a mistake when I was ordering parts. So I ordered parts for this project months ago, in preparation for this video, in case I would need them. And whatever list I was using either wasn't correct, or perhaps I wasn't paying attention. Because some of the caps on this board are axial caps. And for some bloody reason I only ordered radial caps. So the only difference between them is the form factor. So we could just bend the legs and make this work. And perhaps we'll do. But let's check the caps we have removed from the board so far and see what values we get. Okay, so I've got a pile of electrolytic caps here, discharge. Let's check at least a few of these. So this one is a 1000 micro 16 volts. And we've got a very low reading. So ESR is definitely good on this one. and it reads 0.9 millifarads. So that is actually almost 10% off. So let's try another one. So this is a 2200 micro 10 volts. We're getting 0.02, which is very low. We're getting 1.98 millifarads. And this one too is just about within specs. Well, I don't think we need to check the rest, but just out of curiosity, I want to check one of those that had some liquid underneath. So these buggers are 100 micro 200 volts. And this one too is within specs, at least with the ESR. And the capacitance is 0.1 millifarads. So that is actually within specs. I thought these two buggers here were dead for sure. Okay, but that's all we need to know really. This board will probably work for a few more years, but these caps are marginal. So what I'm going to do is to bodge the rest of the caps to fit the board. Okay, let's start with C5 here. And we could of course just order axial caps and replace these caps later on. But I know myself too well, so if I don't fix this now, it may take several years. Okay, let's see what value we've got here. 47 micro 10 volts. Okay, so Nichicon 47 micro 16 volts. Should do the trick. And this cap sits very close to the tube, so I'm gonna lay it flat. And there are plenty of exposed wires on this board, so a few more doesn't matter. And I guess I'll go ahead and recap the rest of the board off camera, unless I find something interesting. Okay, it's moving along quite nicely, and I'm mounting the rest of the cap standing up like this one here. And being a single layer board, this board already has exposed leads on top of the PCB. So I think this hack looks perfectly in place on this board. However, I've noticed something, and I'm gonna do my best to get this on camera, but this is absolutely tiny. But let's try. And it's especially hard because I don't have my preview display. Okay, this is the best I can do. And hopefully you can see on the display, although probably in low resolution, that this cap here has some corrosion where the leg is mounted to the cap. So this is a bad cap indeed. Let me turn it around. Okay, and this is the other side of the cap. And hopefully you can see the corrosion on the leg, just where it's mounted to the cap. So this cap is leaking. And I decided to clean up a few more traces and tin them off camera. So I'm pretty confident now that this board won't corrode any further. And I'm going to indulge Steve Jobs' trigger-happy glue guy. There are some large coils on this board, so perhaps it's needed. And this board is almost finished now. Let's make sure that this bodged cap here stays down and doesn't come too close to the tube. And the only thing left to do now is put this shield back on. So I'll remove these old pads and put new ones on. And apparently our dead bug tried to help me out here. So he has dug through this pad here and made it slightly easier for me. So thanks, little dead bug. And I guess we'll keep things original and add new double-sided pads, just in case we get a visit from another hungry bug. Okay, and I'd say the analog board is now finished. Let's take care of the motherboard. And this should be a lot easier. There's just a small amount of rust on the edges here. And I think it's gonna come off really easily with just some IPA. And it does, so this is just some rust from the chassis. So let's make this board really nice and tidy, like the rest of the machine. And the only problem I have found is corrosion in the connectors. So I'm just going to use some deoxit and hope for the best. And all of the connectors at the back seems to have corrosion. And the keyboard connector at the front has corrosion on one of the pins too. So let's give it the same treatment. And hopefully that is enough. And I think these boards could easily be hacked to take 512K. But I'm not going to bother because I already have a couple of 512 machines. And we'll just keep this one as original as possible. Unlike the analog board, this fancy 4-layer board only has 3 electrolytic caps. And by the way, the board cleaned up really nicely. Aside from those connectors, this board doesn't seem to be affected by the battery at all. I found a dead bug though. So that little creature had a friend here. And somehow I managed to order the correct type of capacitors for this board. And being a 4-layer board, it's a bit more stubborn than the analog board. Well, we didn't check the values of all the caps, but from the values we saw, or those we checked, I'd say you don't really need to recap these boards quite yet. Those electrolytics probably have a few more years in them. And we seem to have a huge piece of copper inside this PCB, because none of the caps came off on the second attempt. Let's try with some good old wick. Yeah, that did a trick. And even with the same value, these new caps are about half the size. Well, this board sure was much easier to fix than the analog board, because we are already done. Well, this Mac proved to be a much longer challenge than I expected. In the next and final part, we are going to restore the keyboard with those crazy pingy Alps SKCC switches. We are also going to restore the mouse and see if we can repair that diskette drive. But I might make another video in between, because I just got a message that something really fun awaits me at the postal office. If you want to see those videos, make sure to use the bell icon below set to all. That way YouTube will notify you when it's out. I would like to end this video by saying thank you to the very first patrons of this channel. If you want to support this channel too, you will find the link in the description below. And now is a good time to watch part 1 if you haven't seen it yet. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.